More and more often nowadays, films that you thought were filmed in a real-world city were actually filmed miles away in front of a big green wall. But CGI has just advanced so far that we literally cannot tell anymore. So how and when on earth did CGI get so realistic that visual effects artists have become capable of generating these gigantic, dense, highly detailed environments that also look absolutely flawless? Well, a lot of us may be familiar with the word procedural because it's kind of become infamous in the last few years, particularly in gaming, to mean something that is completely randomly generated but also adheres to enough rules that this random generation can be understood as, say, a town or a creature or even an entire planet, allowing artists to make entire worlds with relative ease, just with the main caveat being that they are somewhat completely random. And so this is how visual effects artists will create their massive environments for films as well, through rule-based, controllable, random generation. But what happens when you need to generate something that is both giant but is also so specific and so recognizable that it can't just be random? What happens when visual effects artists need to rebuild somewhere like New York? Well, this is the exact challenge faced by both 2005's King Kong and 2011's The Avengers, who both had to rebuild New York completely out of CGI, but both used two very different methods to do so, with two very different results in quality. So that's why in this video we're going to take a look at both of these films and see how they generated their New York, why one looked much better than the other, and how the evolution between these two films ushered in this age of complete large-scale photorealism without us even noticing. So join us as we take a stroll into the expansive world of CGI cities. So why did King Kong need an entirely CGI New York City? Well, usually films can get away with just having a few CGI buildings on screen. You know, mostly just the ones around where the actual action is going on. But when it came to King Kong, director Peter Jackson instead had a very tall order. He wanted to recreate those iconic visuals of Kong atop the Empire State Building, exactly like they were back in 1933. But because that 1933 New York skyline no longer exists today, it meant that if he wanted to do this, he would have to rebuild the entire 90,000 or so buildings that were there 70 years prior completely out of CGI. And not only this, he would also have to capture the city's vastness from the ground level as well, showing that seemingly infinite 1930s concrete jungle stretching on for miles around the film's characters, meaning that he needed CGI buildings that looked good from both the very top and the very bottom of this city. And so whilst creating little bits of CGI cities was stuff we started to see popping up more and more around this time, I do think this is the first time we saw something ever that had to be this precise and of this scale on film. Because this wasn't just any city, this was New York City, deep in the heart of the American Depression. And so to tell the desperate story of all of these different people and their individual attempts to escape the misery of this time, Peter Jackson also really needed this CGI to authentically show just how decrepit and grimy and generally bad this era was for the people of the time, so that he could set the stage as to what the characters in this film were desperately running from. And so, to pull this off, as he had done previously with Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson looked to the visual effects studio WETA in New Zealand, who'd already helped him craft everything from massive battles between multiple armies to a fully CGI golem, and now it was them who he was tasking with bringing this fully CGI city to life. But now, before we go on, I do just want to apologise for the visual quality of a lot of this behind the scenes footage, because sadly a lot of these visuals are from a really low resolution presentation from like 2005 and was never part of a nice DVD release or anything like that. But please bear with it because there's some really interesting stuff in here that I'm amazed no one else has really talked about, and I've done my best to make it look as good as possible. So yeah, the team at WETA sat down and tried to figure out where they could even start with building a city from 70 years ago. And eventually they decided that the first key to all of this would be figuring out the actual layout of the buildings that New York City had back then, and then converting this layout into very simplistic 3D geometry. Because if they could just get the silhouette of this city locked down as 3D geometry, even if it was just a bare bones representation, then they could use this as a baseline for everything else moving forwards. However, figuring out this layout was much easier said than done, because the only real documentation of what New York City's layout was back in the 1930s was these old, blurry, grainy photographs and videos from the time. I mean, sure, there were maps and stuff like that they could go and look at, but they didn't visually actually show the individual buildings like the King Kong team needed to recreate. And so initially, their only choice to build this layout was to go through these photographs one by one and meticulously determine which building should go where and why, which would have taken genuinely forever to do. And so it was very fortunate that they eventually also realized that modern day New York's layout is visually well documented. And so rather than rebuilding this entire backbone city from scratch, it would be much easier to just get a simplistic 3D map of what New York City looks like nowadays and just cross compare that against these old photographs. Because in doing this, they could trawl through all of this data and begin to slowly eliminate buildings from the modern map that weren't in those 1930s pictures. Meaning that eventually, after removing enough modern day buildings, whilst also accounting for any missing buildings in this comparison process, this map of modern day New York buildings would turn into a map of only 1930s New York buildings. And so, after doing this, they now had this fantastic bare bones 3D layout of the city that they were going to build. But bare bones was the key word here, because to get this city anywhere near cinematic quality, they would need to cover each of these basic buildings with all of the little details you'd expect to see scattered across a city, like doors at ground level, or chimneys across rooftops, or facades coating the edges of every structure. And so with only 2 years to do this for the 90,000 or so buildings in this skyline, the only way they could actually manage to populate this city with all of these details would be if they could somehow find a way to automate this process, but automate it in a way which maintained that unique 1930s New York identity. And so this is exactly what the VFX artists at WETA set out to do. For the key buildings like the Empire State Building, they crafted those by hand. But for the rest of the city, they ended up designing a brand new system called CityBot, which could iterate over every single part of this bare-bones city, and then, by pulling from a library of pre-made objects, also known as assets, figure out and place exactly which asset should be in that area, thus automatically detailing every single inch of this city for them. Which sounds like something modern day AI has only just started to figure out. So how the hell did this work back in the early 2000s? Well, basically, by starting from a single point, this system would divide the city up into 22 million individual areas or cells. And then for each of these different cells, the algorithm could figure out where in the city they were, what part of the building they contained, and what the cells around them also contained. And then by analyzing all of this information, the system could then predict exactly which asset should be placed in that cell. So for example, if the cell was on the ground floor of the building and facing the street, then the system could figure this out and logically decide that this is where the door asset should most likely be. Because in a city, your front door is most commonly connected directly to the street. And so therefore, it would make the most sense for the system to place a door between the street and the building. And so by this kind of logic, the system could work its way across the building and arrange things like windows along its sides or chimneys and water towers across its rooftop, until finally, this once bare bones digital building now had as many different visual elements as you see on any building in the real world. And so just like this, the system could automatically, over time, trawl through this entire initial backbone layout of the city and slowly populate it with all the details it needed to feel like a genuine city. However, speaking of adding life to this city, once CityBot had done its job and they could now visualize this fully detailed city in all of its glory, they realized that there was one pretty big problem. But before we get to that, when the sponsor of today's video, Opera, first got in touch with me about trying out their new free browser, I thought, realistically, what more can a web browser actually do for me? But then when I installed it and started actually playing around, I was suddenly shocked by just how good this browser was. Because firstly, it was just so clean and fluid, as rather than having to have hundreds of tabs open, Opera has this tab islands feature here, where tabs of a similar kind are rolled up into these nice clean groups, and at the same time, it also has this sidebar thing here, which houses all of these different workspaces. And so basically, between these two features, you can divide up and organize all of your different major tasks and just hop between and keep track of everything with complete ease. But on top of this sidebar also gives you constant access to those websites that you have to have open every day anyway, like various social medias, entertainment stuff like Spotify, or even Opera's completely free AI, Aria, which you can either directly chat to or use its on-the-fly highlight feature feature to expand upon or even translate anything you read, meaning that when you combine this with its free built-in VPN and its free tracker blocker, it just meant the whole thing felt like this safe, ad-free, smooth, more productive, and just modern browsing experience. And honestly, it just made other browsers feel like I was just banging rocks together. So I honestly wholeheartedly recommend checking out Opera's free browser and leaving the stone age of web browsers behind today. So thank you to Opera for sponsoring this video. And now back to this pretty big problem, which was that because they'd built this city via computer algorithms, everything was just kind of perfect and fresh and clean, and thus it just really looked like something that was computer generated and not the dirty old grimy lived-in city that New York was. And so what it needed to go through was a pretty usual part of the CGI creation process called weathering, which is where usually artists go in and remove all of these computer generated perfections in an object and purposefully give it all of those imperfections you'd expect to see in real life, like scratches, grime, dirt, and even little stuff like fingerprints. But once again, they had the exact same issue as before, that there's just so many buildings here, and therefore you can't exactly have your artists sit down and do all of this custom art direction for tens of thousands of them, which meant this too somehow also needed automating. And so, rather brilliantly, this is where the artists turned to the mother of both automation and weathering, nature itself, the ultimate enemy, because they figured that most of the major aging that a city gets actually comes from the weather which encapsulates that area. And so what they concluded was that to recreate this same aging digitally, the easiest solution would be to just leverage nature as well. And so what they did was go and get some realistic computer simulations of the major types of weather you'd tend to see in New York, so like rain or snow, and then start to run those simulations across large chunks of this digital New York City, using the rain simulations to generate things like the dingy streaks you see, and using the snow simulations to cause snow to pile up on rooftops or outcrops or street corners. And the results of this actually looked really, really good, as even though these types of simulations are really, really darn slow to do, they actually tend to generate these insanely realistic results. Because the reason they're slow is because they sit there for hours perfectly calculating how to exactly mimic reality. And so what this all meant was that once these simulations had actually run across this city, just like that, they had very naturally and basically automatically aged this once perfect city into the run-down and depreciated city that 1930s New York sadly was, meaning that all they had to do now was add in all of those little finishing touches to this CGI city. Stuff like street signs on corners or CG crowds and traffic to wander through these streets and give it that true sense of being alive. But sadly, despite all of this effort, and despite how technically impressive this work is, at the end of the day, the end result just doesn't really look flawless enough. And this is because the scales are just so vast, which not only makes it impossible to reach the perfection needed for every single building to look good enough, but also made just doing simple tasks like trying to display all of these buildings at once a very difficult task for clunky 2005 hardware. And so, with the technology of the time really holding them back in a lot of different ways like this, and causing them to have to cut a lot of different corners just to get this to even remotely work, what it meant was that when it came to having such a heavy dependence on CGI in scenes that were supposed to be the most climactic scenes in the film, this less than realistic appearance really just kind of detracts from the whole cinematic movie experience. And yeah, for sure, there were times when it worked and you really can't tell it's CGI, but at other times, even when it's tucked away in the background behind both full-sized and miniature sets, there was often still just something wrong with it. And so with King Kong being the major visual effects stepping stone that it was, with both its facial animation for Kong himself and its city building for New York, was there another way that filmmakers and visual effects artists could bring New York City to life in a fashion which maximized its visual fidelity? Well, 7 years later, 2012's The Avengers faced a very similar problem, as they too needed to make a digital New York as a playground for the film's characters to fight within. And with this battle also being the big climactic finale to their film, ideally, they didn't want their ending to stumble at the last hurdle and get criticized for having too much CGI, but instead be that perfect capstone to the film which would leave audiences walking away satisfied. And so, to answer this, they had a completely different approach to crafting their New York City. Instead of spreading their resources too thin and generating an entire CGI city, they decided decided to focus primarily around just a single street and enhance that to look as realistic as possible. Because the cheat code that the Avengers team had, which was not available to the King Kong team, was that the New York City that they were building still actually exists in the modern day, meaning they could circumvent a lot of these issues we already mentioned. Because, for example, for all of these wide shots that contained a lot of the city, they didn't have to rebuild the entire city from scratch, as they could primarily just use footage of the modern day city itself and just enhance that with CGI overlays. But far more importantly, with this modern day city actually existing, what they were also able to do was use photography as the backbone for their entire city. Because if you go and take a photograph of a building, then think about it. That simple photograph already naturally contains all of those tiny little details that the King Kong team was spending forever crafting out of CGI. So stuff like doors or windows or cladding on the facade, all of that detail is going to get captured in the photograph by the camera, which sounds pretty ideal, right? Like, why are visual effects artists messing around with all of this heavy and dense CGI when they could just be using photographs of stuff? Well, there is one small issue with photography, which is that photographs are obviously two-dimensional and don't have any depth to them, and so you can't really just plonk them in the movie and expect them to start looking good. Because without this depth, then the moment the camera moves, they're just going to stand out immediately as two-dimensional and just look obviously wrong. However, with these photographs looking so realistic, then they're obviously a super ideal thing for visual effects artists who are constantly looking to mimic reality. And so with their main issue being that they just look two-dimensional, then visual effects artists have actually gotten quite clever when it comes to circumventing this one drawback. Because what they realized was that if they just projected these photographs across some very simple 3D geometry, then they could quite easily add that depth right back into the picture, using the 3D geo for the structures and the shapes, and the photography for the details and the colors, giving them this nice high quality fake city that's details were coming more from photography than it was slow heavy CGI that would just drag their computers down. And so to make this possible, all they needed was a bunch of photos of New York City. And so the Avengers team set out across 7 miles of New York City streets and took multiple photographs of every single building in the area. And then after this, they slowly layered these photos up across bare bones 3D versions of these buildings, matching the pictures of the buildings up against their basic 3D clones until they had this very convincing result, which really enabled this final battle to work seamlessly. But now, I've made this whole process sound insanely simplistic. Like, they just popped into New York one day, ran around a bit, taking some nice photographs, and job done, you've got a nice CGI city. But this is absolutely not the case, because all of this photography had to go through a lot of custom processing to get them ready to be projected across these buildings, and also a lot of work had to go into setting up these bare bones buildings in the first place, matching them up to the camera's movement and all this stuff. But more so than all of this, just taking these photographs was an absolute nightmare in general, because to keep everything looking consistent throughout this digital city, the photographers had to make sure that all of these building pictures were taken under the exact same weather conditions, causing them to have to zigzag through New York to make sure that each area of the city was taken around the same time of day, in addition to accounting for tiny little things like subtle changes in weather and how that would affect the lighting. But like we said, in the end, these efforts were definitely worth it, because it really enabled the ending of this film to completely stick the landing. And in a film that's filled with so many other spectacular moments, it is really easy to overlook something as simple and as subtle as this, and so it definitely deserved more credit than it ever got for how much it enabled this film to do. But now, I do just want to make it clear that I'm not saying the Avengers pioneered this technique at all. Stuff like photographing buildings and then turning them into CGI was being used all the way back in 2002 for stuff like the original Spider-Man swinging scenes, and probably well before that as well. And so I'm just using the Avengers as a good example, because with both it and King Kong being set in New York, it just provided a great point of comparison to show the differences between these two techniques. And so, having been like 14 years since the first Avengers movie, Christ, I'm old, and even longer since Peter Jackson's King Kong, how have all of these methods evolved over the years to give us these seamless results which we have now? Well, at the end of the day, each of these techniques are still in use in one way or another, because each and every one still has its place. For example, the more recent Avengers films were using this technique like mad, with the Battle of Greenwich Village having one of the most seamless environment replacements I've ever seen. Whereas films like Alita Battle Angel instead used a lot of fully CGI techniques to build their city. Because whilst this photography style method that we see in the Avengers may naturally give you more photorealism, it does really still have have its limits, like how long it takes to get all the photography needed if you want to use it for a giant area, or much more importantly, that it's limited to having to be based on something you can actually photograph in real life, meaning that if you want a large or completely fictional environment, then going down King Kong's fully CGI route will yield much better results, especially because nowadays, due to the general advances in both CGI and computer technology, this CGI city is going to look a lot better than King Kong did back in 2005. So basically what I'm saying is that you can work to balance out the fully CGI method's scale with the photography-based method's realism, and then you can go and tie both of these methods in with practical foreground sets and effects and have it result in those insanely realistic CGI backgrounds that are so good that you end up not seeing them anyway. But now, I do just want to make it clear that I'm not saying that every single film will use these exact methods every single time, but instead that each film will have its own slightly unique spin on how they utilize these different techniques, depending on what that specific film is using that specific city for. For example, you'll very often see pictures projected on just simple flat pieces of geometry, rather than a fully three-dimensional building, as if they're just tucked away in the distance, then typically that's all they need to look realistic. And so these are just general examples to show the inner workings of this process, but as with everything, there's variations with divergences along the way to the end result, especially as you start to look to lower budget films, TV shows, or even adverts, where filmmakers can get away with that far more simple, but also far more random game style of procedural generation, which we mentioned earlier, pulling from libraries of big pre-made and pre-detailed assets, and then rapidly building these up into entire cities based around just a simple set of rules. Or perhaps they'll only choose to selectively enhance somewhere real, with just a little bit of CGI, like we saw in films like Dread. But basically, I think, however you cut it, I think it's safe to say that King Kong was a genuine, underrated VFX stepping stone that opened the door for every single movie set in a CGI city moving forwards, and also allowed VFX artists to learn the lessons needed to create these completely invisible environments that we will never notice. But what do you guys think? What other films have successfully created an old city like King Kong did? And how often do you think characters are secretly in a completely CGI world these days? But yeah, if you like this video and you want to see more deep dives into the best VFX of the last 20 years, then please let me know in the comments below, drop a like and subscribe. Oh, and we also have a Discord channel where we chat about a lot of this stuff too, so please check the link in the description for that as well. Oh, and finally, I just want to give a massive thank you to all of my Patreon subs. So thank you to Matt Locke, Kyle Hofling, an even bigger thank you to Rye Jones, Darren Birmingham, Lime, Ishita Thakar on YouTube, and of course, Darth Gader. Your support is genuinely invaluable to keeping the quality of this content as high as possible, so thank you once again for your support. But otherwise, yeah, thank you for watching and have a great day.